One of the most common mistakes people make is assuming that the quietest person in the room is also the weakest. We tend to associate strength with volume, dominance, confrontation, and visible displays of power. If someone argues back, fights for attention, or demands to be heard, we immediately recognize their presence. But there is another kind of strength that operates very differently. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't seek control. And because of that, it is often underestimated. This is especially true when it comes to empaths. An empath is not simply someone who feels deeply. That's an oversimplification. An empath is often someone who has developed an extraordinary awareness of human behavior. They pay attention to emotional patterns that most people miss. They notice inconsistencies between words and actions. They recognize shifts in energy, changes in tone, subtle facial expressions, and unspoken tensions. While others are focused on what is being said, the empath is paying attention to why it is being said. This creates an interesting paradox. Because empaths understand people so well, they often extend more patience than most individuals would. They give second chances, then third chances, then fourth chances. Not because they are naive, but because they can see the pain, insecurity, fear, or confusion driving someone's behavior. The average person sees the action. The empath sees the wound behind the action. And that is where the misunderstanding begins. When someone repeatedly receives patience, understanding, and forgiveness, they can start believing that these things are automatic. They assume they will always be available. They begin treating empathy like a permanent resource rather than a gift. Over time, they become comfortable with the idea that no matter what they do, the empath will continue to understand. Psychologically, this is a fascinating phenomenon. Human beings adapt quickly to whatever becomes familiar. We stop appreciating what is consistently present. What was once extraordinary becomes expected. What was once valued becomes overlooked. The empath's kindness becomes background noise. Their support becomes invisible. Their loyalty becomes assumed. And because they rarely demand recognition, people often fail to realize how much they contribute to a relationship, friendship, workplace, or family dynamic. The empath notices this long before anyone else does. They notice when their effort is no longer appreciated. They notice when conversations become one-sided. They notice when their understanding is expected but never returned. They notice when they are constantly giving while others are constantly taking. But here's what many people fail to understand. Empaths don't usually react immediately to these realizations. Most people have a breaking point that looks dramatic. They explode. They confront. They create conflict. They make their dissatisfaction impossible to ignore. Empaths often do the opposite. They observe. They collect information. They reflect. They give people opportunities to correct course. What appears to be passivity is often patience. What appears to be weakness is often restraint. And restraint is one of the most misunderstood forms of power. Anyone can react emotionally in the moment. Anyone can lash out when hurt. It takes a much higher level of emotional control to remain composed while processing disappointment. The empath understands that every action has a cause, every behavior has a story, and every person is fighting battles that may not be visible. That understanding keeps them engaged far longer than most people would stay. Unfortunately, this is exactly why they are often taken for granted. People mistake the absence of confrontation for the absence of consequences. They assume that because the empath hasn't left, they never will. Because the empath hasn't complained loudly, they must not be affected. Because the empath continues showing up, they must be okay. But beneath the surface, something important is happening. Every ignored conversation, every dismissed feeling, every broken promise, every moment of emotional neglect, the empath notices all of it. Not necessarily with anger, not necessarily with resentment, but with awareness. And awareness accumulates. This is where philosophy intersects with psychology. There is an old idea that nothing changes all at once. Every major transformation begins invisibly. A mountain erodes one grain at a time. Trust disappears one disappointment at a time. Emotional connection fades one neglected moment at a time. The same principle applies here. People often expect relationships to end because of a dramatic event, but many of the most significant endings begin quietly. They begin with small realizations, tiny observations, private conclusions that never get spoken aloud. The empath starts asking questions. Why am I always the one understanding everyone else? Why is my effort expected but not appreciated? Why am I carrying responsibilities that belong to other people? Why am I fighting for connections that others seem willing to neglect? These questions don't create immediate distance. They create clarity. And clarity changes everything. Because once someone sees a pattern clearly, they can never completely unsee it. This is why ignoring an empath is such a dangerous mistake. Not because they will seek revenge, not because they will retaliate, but because they will eventually see the truth without the emotional filters that once kept them attached. And when that happens, the entire relationship changes. The person who thought they were being tolerated discovers they were being understood. The person who assumed loyalty was guaranteed discovers it was a choice. The person who confused patience with weakness discovers they misunderstood strength entirely. By the time these realizations arrive, the empath has often already begun an internal journey that nobody else can see, a journey away from disappointment, away from self-sacrifice, away from relationships that survive only because one person keeps carrying the weight. And the most remarkable part is that this transformation usually happens in silence. No announcement, no warning, no dramatic speech, just a growing awareness that their energy deserves a better destination. Because the strongest people are not always the loudest. Sometimes the strongest person is the one who stays patient long after others would have walked away. But never mistake that patience for permanence. The moment someone stops taking your kindness for granted may be the moment they realize it was your strength all along. What makes this next stage so important is that most people never see it coming. They assume that if an empath is hurt, there will be a confrontation, there will be an argument, an emotional discussion, or at the very least some obvious sign that something is wrong. But the reality is often much more subtle than that. The moment everything truly begins to change is not when the empath gets angry. It is when the empath stops explaining. This is a distinction that most people completely miss. When someone still argues with you, they are investing energy. When someone still tries to make you understand their perspective, they are investing energy. When someone repeats the same concern over and over, hoping that this time you'll hear it differently, they are investing energy. Frustrating as those conversations may be, they are evidence of something important. Emotional commitment still exists. The empath is still fighting for the connection. What people fail to recognize is that explanation itself is a form of hope. Every time an empath says, "This hurt me," they are expressing hope that the relationship can improve. Every time they communicate a boundary, they are expressing hope that it will be respected. Every time they attempt to clarify their feelings, they are expressing hope that understanding is possible. Hope is what fuels those conversations. Hope is what keeps people trying. Hope is what keeps them emotionally invested, long after logic suggests they should leave. But hope is not unlimited. Psychologically speaking, human beings can tolerate a surprising amount of disappointment when they believe their efforts are meaningful. People endure hardship, uncertainty, and frustration when they feel progress is possible. Remove that sense of possibility, however, and something changes dramatically. Motivation begins to collapse. The empath experiences this shift internally before anyone else notices it externally. At first, they explain. Then they explain again. Then they find different words, different examples, different approaches. They become more patient, more understanding, more accommodating. They keep searching for the right combination of words that will finally create mutual understanding. But eventually a realization emerges. The problem isn't that the message is unclear. The problem is that the other person isn't listening. This realization is one of the most emotionally significant moments in any relationship, because once someone understands that they are not being misunderstood but ignored, the entire situation looks different. Think about the psychological difference. Being misunderstood leaves room for optimism. It suggests that communication can solve the problem. Being ignored suggests something much deeper. It suggests that the issue isn't information, it's attention, it's priority, it's willingness. And when an empath reaches that conclusion, they stop trying to persuade, not because they don't care, because they finally understand that caring harder won't change the outcome. This is where emotional exhaustion begins to transform into emotional detachment. Many people think detachment happens suddenly. They imagine a person waking up one morning and deciding they no longer care. That's rarely how it works. Detachment is usually the result of repeated emotional effort that produces no meaningful response. It's not the absence of feeling, it's the consequence of feeling too much for too long. The empath slowly realizes that they have been carrying conversations that require two participants. They have been maintaining connections that require mutual effort. They have been solving problems that cannot be solved alone. And perhaps most importantly, they begin recognizing the difference between someone's words and someone's actions. This distinction becomes impossible to ignore. People often promise change. They promise attention. They promise understanding. They promise improvement. But promises create comfort only temporarily. Patterns reveal reality. And empaths are exceptionally skilled at recognizing patterns. They notice when apologies become repetitive. They notice when commitments are made and forgotten. They notice when concern appears only after consequences begin to emerge. Over time, these observations accumulate into certainty. Not anger, not bitterness, certainty. And certainty is powerful, because uncertainty keeps people attached. Certainty sets them free. Once the empath becomes certain that their voice is no longer influencing the relationship, something remarkable happens. They become quieter, not because they have less to say, because they no longer believe saying it will matter. This is often the moment that confuses everyone around them. The arguments stop, the complaints disappear, the emotional conversations become less frequent. The empath seems calmer, more distant, less reactive. And the other person interprets this as improvement. They think the issue has been resolved. They think things are finally peaceful. In reality, the opposite may be happening. The empath is no longer trying to fix what they have already accepted. This is one of the most misunderstood psychological signals in human relationships. When people care deeply, they engage. When they stop engaging, it doesn't always mean they are at peace. Sometimes it means they have begun letting go. And letting go often happens long before anyone physically leaves. Philosophically, this reflects a truth about human nature that appears again and again throughout life. People don't abandon what matters to them easily. Before someone releases a meaningful connection, they usually attempt to save it repeatedly. The final departure is rarely the first step. It's the last step in a long internal process. A process filled with reflection, disappointment, patience, and effort. The empath understands this process better than most, because they naturally search for reasons to stay. They focus on potential. They focus on possibilities. They focus on the best parts of people. But eventually, reality becomes stronger than potential. What someone could become loses its influence compared to what they consistently choose to be. That realization changes everything. Because once an empath stops explaining, they start listening differently. They stop listening to promises. They start listening to patterns. They stop listening to intentions. They start listening to actions. They stop asking for understanding. They start evaluating whether understanding exists at all. And this shift marks the beginning of a profound transformation. Not a transformation driven by revenge. Not a transformation driven by anger. A transformation driven by clarity. The kind of clarity that emerges when someone finally accepts reality instead of defending hope. By the time others recognize this change, the empath has often traveled a great emotional distance internally. The conversations they once fought to have no longer seem necessary. The validation they once sought no longer seems important. The explanations they once repeated no longer seem worth giving. Because there comes a moment when wisdom replaces persuasion. A moment when self-respect becomes stronger than attachment. A moment when silence says what words never could. And when someone who has spent years trying to be understood suddenly stops explaining. The question isn't why they've become quiet. The real question is, how many chances were missed before they decided their silence was worth more than another conversation? Once an empath reaches the point where they stop explaining, something even more significant begins to happen. This is the stage that many people never anticipate, because it unfolds quietly, almost invisibly. There are no dramatic declarations, no grand exits, no attempts to punish anyone. Instead, there is a shift in where the empath's energy is directed, and that shift changes everything. For a long time, the empath's attention has been focused outward. They have been reading the emotions of others, anticipating needs, offering support, solving conflicts, and carrying emotional burdens that were never entirely theirs to carry. This becomes such a natural part of who they are that many people begin to see it as permanent. They assume the empath will always be available, always understanding, always willing to absorb stress and provide stability. What they fail to recognize is that attention is one of the most valuable resources a human being possesses. Where attention goes, energy follows. Where energy flows, relationships grow. And when an empath decides to redirect that energy, the effects are often far greater than anyone expects. Psychologically, human beings tend to notice what is present far less than they notice what is absent. This is a principle that appears repeatedly throughout life. We adapt quickly to comfort, support, consistency, and reliability. What is constantly available becomes psychologically invisible. We stop consciously recognizing it because our minds begin treating it as normal. This is why people often underestimate the value of someone who is consistently supportive. The support becomes expected. The encouragement becomes routine. The emotional labor becomes unnoticed. The empath's presence becomes part of the background. Then one day, that background disappears. Suddenly, the emotional cushion that softened every difficult moment is gone. The person who listened without judgment is no longer available. The person who remembered details, offered perspective, and provided reassurance has stepped back. And that's when a powerful realization begins to emerge. The relationship was receiving far more from the empath than anyone realized. This realization is often delayed because people rarely calculate emotional contributions accurately. We tend to measure visible effort while overlooking invisible effort. Visible effort is easy to recognize: a favor, a gift, a financial contribution, a completed task. Invisible effort is harder to measure: patience, understanding, emotional regulation, conflict prevention, quiet encouragement. The empath specializes in invisible effort. And because invisible effort cannot be easily counted, it is often undervalued until it disappears. This creates an interesting psychological phenomenon. When the empath withdraws emotionally, they are not necessarily taking something away. In many cases, they are simply stopping the continuous investment they have been making for years. The difference is profound. Imagine carrying extra weight for someone every day. Then one day you put the weight down. From your perspective, you are simply returning to balance. But from the other person's perspective, it feels like something important has been removed. That is often what emotional withdrawal feels like. The empath is no longer compensating for the imbalance. They are no longer filling every gap, no longer solving every conflict, no longer initiating every difficult conversation, no longer rescuing every struggling connection. And once that happens, reality becomes much harder to ignore. This is where many people experience an uncomfortable truth. The relationship functioned not because both individuals were contributing equally, but because one person was quietly contributing more than anyone realized. For years, the empath may have been translating misunderstandings into compassion, converting frustration into patience, transforming disappointment into another opportunity, protecting the relationship from consequences that should have arrived much earlier. When that process stops, the natural results of people's actions begin catching up with them, not as punishment, as reality. And reality has a way of revealing truths that comfort often conceals. Philosophically, there is an important lesson here. Many people believe strength is demonstrated through control. They think power comes from forcing outcomes, dominating situations, or influencing others. But some of the most powerful changes occur not through action, but through withdrawal. By refusing to participate in unhealthy dynamics, a person alters the entire structure of a relationship. The empath understands this, even if they don't consciously articulate it. They begin recognizing that their energy has value, their attention has value, their emotional investment has value, and perhaps for the first time, they start asking whether the return justifies the cost. This question changes their behavior. Instead of constantly focusing on who needs them, they begin focusing on what they need. Instead of solving everyone else's problems, they begin examining their own goals. Instead of spending hours managing other people's emotions, they begin protecting their own peace. To outside observers, this transformation can appear surprising. Some interpret it as selfishness. Others interpret it as coldness. But neither interpretation is accurate. What is actually happening is balance. The empath is no longer sacrificing themselves to maintain connections that require mutual effort. And balance often looks unfamiliar to people who benefited from imbalance. This is why emotional withdrawal can feel so shocking to those who once depended on the empath's constant availability. The support they relied on is no longer automatic. The understanding they expected is no longer guaranteed. The emotional safety net they took for granted is no longer present. For the first time, they are forced to experience the full weight of their own actions without someone constantly softening the impact. That experience can be deeply unsettling, because absence creates clarity. When something valuable disappears, its importance becomes impossible to ignore. The encouraging words that seemed ordinary suddenly feel irreplaceable. The patience that seemed endless suddenly feels rare. The loyalty that seemed guaranteed suddenly reveals itself as a choice. And perhaps most importantly, people begin realizing that what they considered weakness was actually strength. The empath was never staying because they lacked options. They were staying because they cared. They were never remaining silent because they were powerless. They were remaining silent because they were exercising restraint. They were never giving endlessly because they had nothing else to offer. They were giving because they chose to. Once that choice changes, everything changes. And this is the stage where consequences truly begin to take shape. Not through revenge, not through confrontation, but through the simple removal of something that was quietly holding everything together. Because people rarely understand the value of emotional presence until they experience emotional absence. And when someone who has carried more than their share finally puts the weight down, everyone else discovers exactly how heavy it was. By the time we arrive at this stage, something important has already happened. The empath has stopped explaining. They've redirected their energy. They've begun investing in themselves rather than endlessly investing in people who failed to appreciate what they were receiving. And yet, in many cases, the people around them still haven't fully understood what is taking place. That understanding often arrives later, much later. And when it does, it tends to arrive all at once. This is where the consequences begin. Not the dramatic consequences people often imagine. Not revenge. Not retaliation. Not some calculated attempt to make others suffer. The consequences are psychological. They emerge from a collision between reality and realization. They appear when someone finally sees what was there all along and understands it only after it's gone. One of the most fascinating aspects of human psychology is that we are not particularly good at recognizing value in the present moment. We are much better at recognizing value in hindsight. When something is available every day, the mind adapts to it. We stop noticing it. We stop measuring its importance accurately. What once felt special begins to feel normal. What once inspired gratitude becomes expected. This process is called adaptation, and it influences nearly every area of human life. People adapt to success. People adapt to comfort. People adapt to opportunity. And perhaps most dangerously, people adapt to good people. The empath often becomes a victim of this psychological tendency. Their consistency creates familiarity. Their reliability creates comfort. Their willingness to understand creates emotional security. Over time, those qualities stop feeling extraordinary. They simply become part of the environment. Like oxygen, always there, always available, rarely appreciated, until they're gone. And when they're gone, something unexpected happens. The absence becomes impossible to ignore. The messages become shorter. The conversations become less frequent. The emotional support disappears. The availability that once seemed endless suddenly has limits. At first, many people dismiss these changes. They assume the empath just needs space. They assume things will return to normal. They assume that because the empath has always come back before, they'll come back again. But gradually a realization begins to form. This isn't temporary. Something fundamental has changed. And that's when regret enters the picture. Regret is one of the most powerful emotional experiences a human being can have, because it is rooted in comparison. The mind compares what exists now with what could have existed if different choices had been made. The painful part is that regret almost always arrives after opportunity has passed. If opportunity still exists, we call it a decision. When opportunity disappears, we call it regret. The person who ignored the empath begins replaying old conversations, moments they dismissed, concerns they minimized, warnings they overlooked, opportunities they failed to appreciate. Suddenly, events that once seemed insignificant begin taking on new meaning. The empath wasn't being dramatic. They were trying to communicate. The empath wasn't demanding attention. They were asking for reciprocity. The empath wasn't threatening to leave. They were revealing how close they were to their limit. Psychologically, this process can be deeply uncomfortable because it forces a confrontation with personal responsibility. It's easier to believe someone left unexpectedly. It's harder to admit they spent months or years showing signs that were ignored. The mind naturally searches for explanations that protect the ego. Maybe the empath changed. Maybe they're overreacting. Maybe someone else influenced them. Anything feels easier than acknowledging a difficult truth. The truth that their departure was not caused by one moment. It was caused by a pattern that was visible long before the consequences appeared. This realization often creates a second emotional experience: confusion. People become confused because they expected the empath to continue behaving the way they always had. They expected more patience, more understanding, more forgiveness, more chances. What they didn't understand was that patience has limits. Not because patience is weak, because patience exists alongside self-respect. And eventually, self-respect demands action. This is the point where many people attempt to reconnect. Not necessarily because they've become different, but because they finally recognize what they've lost. The phone calls begin. The messages become longer. The apologies become more sincere. The effort suddenly appears. And from a psychological perspective, this makes perfect sense. Loss sharpens perception. When something disappears, the brain assigns it greater value. Economists call this scarcity. Psychologists call it loss aversion. Whatever the label, the effect is the same. People often fight hardest for something only after realizing it can no longer be taken for granted. But here's where the situation becomes complicated. The empath who once would have responded immediately is no longer the same person. Not because they are angry, because they have evolved. During the period when others were assuming everything was fine, the empath was changing internally. They were processing, reflecting, healing, learning. They were building a life that no longer depended on validation from the people who ignored them. By the time regret arrives for one person, acceptance has often arrived for the other. This creates a painful asymmetry. One person is just beginning to understand the loss. The other person has already spent months making peace with it. And that's why attempts to reconnect frequently feel unsuccessful. The empath isn't resisting because they want revenge. They're resisting because they finally discovered peace. And peace is difficult to abandon once you've fought hard to create it. Philosophically, this reveals an important truth about human relationships. Value is easiest to recognize before it's gone. Yet many people wait until absence forces recognition. They postpone appreciation, delay gratitude, assume loyalty, expect understanding, and then act surprised when those things eventually disappear. The tragedy is that most meaningful losses are preventable, not through perfection, not through never making mistakes, but through attention. through listening, through recognizing the value of someone while they are still standing beside you instead of waiting until they are walking away. Because relationships rarely collapse from a single failure. They erode through repeated neglect of small moments that seem insignificant at the time. And those small moments accumulate. A missed conversation, an ignored concern, a dismissed feeling, a forgotten act of kindness. Each one appears harmless in isolation. Together, they create consequences, the kind that arrive quietly, then suddenly, the kind that force people to confront what they failed to appreciate, the kind that teach lessons no explanation could ever fully convey. And perhaps that is the deepest irony of all. The empath spent years trying to help others understand their value through words. Yet the lesson is often learned only after their absence says what their presence never could. As we reach the final stage of this journey, we're looking at something many people never truly understand until it is too late. By now, the empath has stopped explaining. They've withdrawn their energy. The consequences of their absence have begun to surface. Regret has arrived. Recognition has arrived. The people who once overlooked them are finally seeing what was standing in front of them all along. But there is one final lesson left to learn, and it may be the most important lesson of all. The greatest misconception about empaths is that because they are compassionate, they are incapable of leaving. People assume that someone who understands deeply, forgives repeatedly, and loves sincerely will always remain available. They confuse kindness with permanence. But kindness and permanence are not the same thing. In fact, some of the strongest acts of self-respect come from people who have spent years being kind. Because eventually, every empath encounters a moment where they must answer a difficult question. How much of yourself are you willing to sacrifice to preserve a relationship that no longer honors your value? At first, the answer is usually generous. A little more patience, a little more understanding, a little more effort, a little more time. The empath believes people can change because they have spent their lives seeing potential in others. They focus on possibilities instead of limitations. They look beyond flaws and recognize the humanity behind mistakes. This is one of their greatest strengths. It is also one of their greatest vulnerabilities, because seeing the best in people can sometimes blind you to the reality of who they have consistently choose to be. For years, the empath may hold on to hope, hope that conversations will matter, hope that promises will become actions, hope that awareness will lead to change. But there comes a point when hope and reality can no longer occupy the same space. Reality begins demanding attention. Patterns become impossible to ignore. Actions become louder than intentions. And the empath is forced to confront a truth they have postponed for a very long time. Love cannot survive on potential alone. No relationship can thrive solely on what someone might become someday. Relationships exist in reality, not imagination. And when reality repeatedly contradicts hope, the empath eventually makes a decision. Not a decision fueled by anger, not a decision fueled by bitterness, a decision fueled by clarity. This is where many people become confused. They expect the empath to leave dramatically. They expect resentment. They expect conflict. But what often happens is something much quieter. The empath simply accepts what is true. Acceptance is one of the most powerful psychological states a person can reach, because acceptance ends internal resistance. For years, they may have fought reality. They may have searched for explanations, made excuses, extended grace, offered endless opportunities. But once acceptance arrives, the struggle ends. And when the struggle ends, so does the attachment that was built upon it. This is why the final goodbye of an empath feels so different. It's not impulsive. It's not emotional chaos. It's not an attempt to prove a point. It's the conclusion of a process that has been unfolding internally for a very long time. The decision was not made in a single day. It was built through countless experiences, countless disappointments, countless moments of realization. And because of that, it carries a level of certainty that surprises people. The individual who ignored the empath often believes there is still time. After all, there was always time before. There was always another conversation, another apology, another opportunity, another chance. What they fail to understand is that they are measuring time externally, while the empath has been measuring it internally. The calendar does not determine when someone is finished. Awareness does. And once awareness reaches a certain threshold, the emotional decision has already been made. This is why the final goodbye often feels sudden to one person and inevitable to the other. One person is seeing the outcome. The other person has lived through the entire process. Psychologically, this reflects an important truth about boundaries. Most people misunderstand boundaries as walls designed to keep others out. But healthy boundaries are not walls. They are definitions. They define what behavior is acceptable. They define what treatment is sustainable. They define where self-respect begins and self-sacrifice ends. The empath eventually learns that without boundaries, compassion becomes self-destruction. Without limits, kindness becomes exploitation. Without self-respect, empathy becomes a pathway to emotional exhaustion. This realization changes everything. Because once an empath learns to value their own well-being as much as they value the well-being of others, they become incredibly difficult to manipulate. They stop confusing guilt with responsibility. They stop confusing understanding with obligation. They stop confusing love with endless tolerance. And perhaps most importantly, they stop believing that saving every relationship is their responsibility. That lesson is liberating. It allows them to direct their energy toward people who appreciate it, toward environments that nurture growth, toward relationships built on reciprocity instead of dependency, toward a future that no longer requires constant emotional sacrifice. And that is why the final goodbye of an empath carries such weight. It represents more than the end of a relationship. It represents the beginning of a new relationship with themselves. A relationship built on self-awareness, self-respect, and emotional balance. The irony, of course, is that many people only recognize this transformation after it has already happened. They finally understand the value of the empath. They finally understand the depth of their loyalty. They finally understand how much patience was extended and how many chances were given. But understanding arrives after the opportunity has passed. And that is the lesson at the center of this entire discussion. People rarely lose an empath because of one mistake. They lose them because of a pattern of overlooking what should have been appreciated, dismissing what should have been heard, and taking for granted what should have been valued. The empath did not leave because they stopped caring. They left because they finally started caring about themselves too. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Never assume that someone's kindness means they will stay forever. The people who love the deepest often endure the longest, but once they learn their worth, they walk away with a certainty that no amount of regret can reverse.